He humiliated her in front of everyone, laughing at her trembling hands, saying the poor never belong in elegant places, that her body betrayed her, that she had never been near rich people, and everyone laughed with him, expecting her to lower her head and ask for forgiveness for existing. But Nia looked him in the eyes and responded in 8 languages, each phrase like a blow of dignity, impossible to refute, and silence fell over the restaurant as if the whole world had stopped breathing. And that powerful man, for the first time in his life, felt small. Like if this touched your soul, it's more than a click, it's a silent hug. Comment on how you think this story will end, and if you haven't subscribed yet, it costs you nothing but means a lot to us. Thanks for being here. Maya Johnson walked with a firm step between the tables of the restaurant The High View, in the vibrant heart of New York City. Her hands held the tray with the precision of someone who had learned to balance things much heavier than plates and glasses. At her 23 years, she carried on her shoulders a story that had begun long before that October night, when the lights of the metropolitan city shone against the dark sky like small promises suspended in the air. She had arrived in the United States 3 years ago, leaving behind Nigeria, her family, and a life that oscillated between hope and daily survival. Her mother had told her, in that last conversation before she took the bus toward Lagos, to always carry her dignity with her, as if it were her most valuable possession. Maya remembered those words every morning, when she looked at herself in the mirror before heading out to the restaurant where she worked 6 days a week. The High View was one of those places where money flowed like red wine in crystal glasses. The tablecloths were spotless white, the aromatic candles perfumed every corner, and the diners spoke in low voices about businesses that moved figures Maya couldn't even imagine. She had learned to move through that world without truly belonging to it, like a dancer who knows every step of an unfamiliar choreography. That night, the restaurant was especially crowded. Reservations had been sold out for days, and the service team moved with the synchronization of a well-rehearsed orchestra. Maya had been on her feet for 5 hours, feeling her feet protesting inside the regulation black shoes, but always maintaining that kind smile she had perfected over time. At table number 12, a group of wealthy American businessmen had settled. Maya had observed them from afar while preparing their services in the kitchen. One of them stood out above the others, not only because of his stature, but also because of the way he occupied the space, as if the whole world should accommodate his presence. Mr. Ethan Clark, as she had read in the reservation, a millionaire CEO known in international financial circles. When it was her turn to attend that table, Maya felt something strange in the atmosphere. She had learned to read people's energies, a skill her grandmother had taught her since she was a child in her native village. And that table gave off something dense, something that made her stay alert. She placed the glasses on the table carefully, one by one, feeling her hands trembling slightly from the accumulated fatigue. They were small, almost imperceptible movements, but enough to betray her before eyes that sought defects where to humiliate. Ethan leaned toward his colleagues without even trying to lower his voice. In clear and cutting English, like someone throwing a stone knowing exactly where it will fall, he said, "Look at her hands, shaking like someone who doesn't belong in a place like this. Poor people always try to act refined, but the body always betrays them." Laughter erupted around the table, some uncomfortable, others genuinely cruel. The sound went through Maya as if each burst of laughter were a physical blow. She felt the heat rising up her neck, how her eyes began to burn, how her heart was beating so hard she thought everyone in the restaurant could hear it. But something inside her refused to break. She took a deep breath, maintaining her composure with a strength she didn't even know she possessed. Ethan continued, feeding on the laughter of his companions as if they were applause. Maybe she's scared she might drop something, or maybe it's the first time she's this close to wealthy people. More laughter, stronger, sharper, more ruthless. It was public humiliation. It was the kind of moment that could destroy a person. Ethan was convinced that he had destroyed her, that she would lower her head, ask for forgiveness for existing, and continue serving as if nothing had happened. But Maya raised her face slowly, like someone gathering every piece of their own dignity and putting it back in place. She looked directly into Ethan's eyes. Silence fell over the table, as if someone had disconnected the whole world. And then she spoke. Maya felt how the entire restaurant held its breath. Conversations at neighboring tables flickered out like candles in the wind. The waiters stopped in the middle of their movements. Even the sound of the cutlery against the porcelain seemed to be suspended in the air. First she spoke in English, with a calmness so precise that every word sounded like a scalpel, cutting exactly where it should. My hands don't shake because I'm poor. They shake because I work. Something you don't seem to know how to do. Ethan blinked, surprised. No one spoke to him like that. No one dared. But before he could react, Maya switched languages, like someone changing instruments in the middle of a symphony. In Spanish, her voice flowed clear and serene. The real poverty is in the way you treat others. In French, every syllable sounded like crystal. You have money but no class. In German, firm as steel. Respect one either has or doesn't. And you don't. In Italian, musical and devastating. Your wealth doesn't cover your ignorance. In Arabic, the words flowed with ancestral dignity. Dignity is more precious than anything you own. In Portuguese, soft but relentless. He who humiliates reveals more about himself than about the other. And finally, in Yoruba, the language of her ancestors, firm as a root that goes through the earth. A person with dignity does not beg. Each phrase was an elegant blow, impossible to refute. The conversations around had ceased completely. Diners at the other tables watched open-mouthed. Some waiters had tears in their eyes. No one could believe what they were witnessing. A young waitress answering a multimillionaire in 8 languages, with more dignity in every word than he had shown in his entire speech. Ethan remained motionless. His face lost color, then turned red, then pale again. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time in a long time, he seemed small, crushed not by money but by the absolute absence of humanity that his own words had revealed. Maya held her gaze steady. There was no anger in her eyes, only a clarity that cut deeper than any scream. She took a step back, gave a slight nod of her head, and continued with her service as if she had just returned a balance to the universe that had been momentarily disturbed. The following minutes passed in a dense silence. Ethan did not speak again. His colleagues ate in silence, avoiding looking at each other. When he finally asked for the check, everyone in the restaurant expected him to demand Maya's immediate expulsion, to cause a scandal, to use his power to destroy the career of that woman who had dared to put him in his place. But Ethan got up from his chair, walked toward where Maya was preparing a new tray, and before the astonished gaze of all present, spoke in trembling English. "I was wrong. I was cruel, and you didn't deserve any of it." Then he tried to apologize in Spanish, stumbling over the words. As ashamed as he was sincere, "I'm very sorry, truly." He left a generous tip on the table, but not as penance or as an attempt to buy forgiveness, but as genuine recognition, like someone who had just encountered a person much greater than himself. When Maya returned that night to her small apartment in the Harlem neighborhood, her legs felt as if they had carried mountains. She closed the door behind her and let herself fall onto the sofa she had bought. Second-hand 3 months earlier. The apartment walls were decorated with photographs of her family in Nigeria, memories of a life that seemed to exist in another universe. She took off her shoes and closed her eyes, but instead of rest, she found the echo of that scene repeating over and over in her mind. Ethan's words, the laughter, the subsequent silence, her own voice pronouncing phrases in languages she had learned over years of silent effort. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Sasha, her roommate and best friend, who worked the night shift as a nurse. "Everything okay? You seem strange lately." Maya smiled sadly. She didn't know where to start explaining what had happened. Instead of answering, she opened the drawer of her nightstand and took out a worn notebook. It was her diary, the only place where she could be completely honest with herself. She wrote about that night, about how she had felt her entire life converging in that moment, about how each language she had spoken represented years of nightly study, of staying awake after exhausting workdays, of listening to podcasts while cleaning houses before getting the job at the restaurant. She remembered how she had started learning Spanish on the bus that brought her from Nigeria, using a free app on her old cell phone, how she had perfected French, which she already spoke as a child, by listening to French radio while preparing dinner, how she had learned English by watching subtitled series in the public library. She had studied German with a retired neighbor who gave lessons in exchange for her helping him with groceries. She had absorbed Italian from a family she worked for as a nanny on weekends. Arabic had been taught to her by a group of Moroccan friends in the park. Portuguese came naturally. a close sibling of Spanish. Each language was a door she had opened with her own hands, a world she had conquered with no other weapons than her determination and her hunger to be more than the world expected her to be. She closed the notebook and looked out the window. New York shone in the night, indifferent to the small battles being fought in its streets, in its restaurants, in the hearts of those trying to build a dignified life in a strange land. She thought of her mother, who had never left her village but who spoke with the wisdom of someone who has lived 1,000 lives. She remembered the day of her departure, when she had told her, "It doesn't matter where you go, Maya. Your worth is not in what you have, but in who you are, and you are strong as the baobab tree." That night, for the first time in a long time, Maya felt that she had honored those words. The following days passed with a strange normalcy. In the restaurant, the story of what happened had spread like fire among the staff. Some colleagues looked at her with barely disguised admiration, others with envy, some with genuine respect. The manager, a serious man named Mr. Chen, called her into his office 2 days after the incident. Maya entered prepared for the worst, thinking that perhaps the superiors had decided that a waitress who talked back to customers, regardless of the circumstances, was not compatible with the restaurant's image. Mr. Chen looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Then, to Maya's surprise, he smiled. "I don't know exactly what happened that night," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But I've received calls, many calls. Customers who were present have rebooked, specifically to be served by you. They say they've never seen anything like it, that it was inspiring." Maya blinked, not knowing what to say. "Don't worry," Mr. Chen continued. "You are not in trouble. In fact, I wanted to tell you that your work has always been impeccable. I just want you to know that you have my respect and my support." When Maya left that office, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Recognition. Not the kind of empty recognition that comes from superficial compliments, but the real weight of being seen for who she truly was. That afternoon, while preparing the tables for the night service, one of the younger waiters timidly approached her. "Maya," he said in a low voice, "I wanted to ask you something. How did you learn so many languages? I can barely manage with English, and I've been here for 2 years." Maya looked at him. He was a young man from Mexico, no more than 20 years old, with eyes that still held the vulnerability of someone far from home. "There's no secret," she replied gently. "Just persistence, and the certainty that everything you learn is something no one can take away from you." The young man nodded, absorbed. "Every night after work," Maya continued, "I studied for at least an hour. Sometimes I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. But I did it anyway, because I knew that someday those languages wouldn't just be words, they would be doors." "And that night, did you know you were going to answer him like that?" Maya smiled softly. "No, I didn't plan it, but I think I had been preparing for years without knowing it. My whole life had prepared me for that moment." The young man left with a thoughtful expression, and Maya knew that she had just planted a seed. Perhaps that young man would also start studying at night. Perhaps he too would discover that he was capable of more than he imagined. That's how dignity works, she thought. It spreads like light from one candle to another. 3 weeks after that memorable night, a letter arrived at the restaurant addressed to Maya Johnson. Mr. Chen handed it to her with a curious expression. "Certified mail," he said, "from London." Maya took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper was thick, high quality. In the upper corner there was an elegant logo she didn't immediately recognize. She sat down in the staff locker room, took a deep breath, and opened it. The handwriting was manual, slightly irregular, as if the writer had had to think hard about every word. "Dear Maya," the letter began, "I don't know if this letter will reach your hands, or if when it does, you'll want to tear it up without reading it. I wouldn't blame you if you did, but I need to try anyway." It was from Ethan Clark. Maya felt her heart accelerating. She continued reading. "Since that night in New York, I haven't been able to stop thinking about what happened. Not the shame I felt, although it was profound, but the truth you spoke, with such clarity that it cut through me like nothing had in years." The letter continued for several pages. Ethan recounted things Maya would never have imagined. He talked about his own childhood in a poor neighborhood in Boston, how he had grown up with hunger, with cold, with the constant reminder that he was not enough, how he had built his financial empire not just with hard work, but with an armor of arrogance he used to protect himself from anything that reminded him of where he came from. For years, he wrote, I treated people the way you treated me that night, as if they were invisible, as if they didn't matter, and I did it because deep down I still felt that I didn't matter either, that if someone looked closely enough, they would see the poor boy I used to be and despise me for it. My God, Maya thought, she would never have imagined that behind that cruelty there was so much fragility. Your response, Ethan continued, not only shamed me, it freed me. For the first time in decades I had to face who I really am, and I didn't like what I saw, but I also saw in you something I had forgotten existed. Dignity without the need for cruelty. Strength without the need to humiliate. Greatness that doesn't need to belittle others. Maya felt tears welling up in her eyes. This moving story was taking a turn she never would have anticipated. The letter concluded with a proposal that left her breathless. I have created a scholarship fund, Ethan wrote, aimed at people like you, like I used to be. People who work tirelessly but deserve opportunities to develop their talents. I have named the fund The Dignity of Work in your honor, and I would like you to be the first beneficiary, not as an apology or as penance, but as recognition of what you already are. Extraordinary. Attached to the letter was an application form already partially completed, along with information about translation and interpretation programs at some of the best universities in the United States and Europe. Maya let the letter fall onto her lap and cried. Not from sadness, but from something much more complex. She cried for all the years of silent effort, for every night she had studied until the letters blurred before her tired eyes, for every time she had felt that maybe she would never be enough. And now, this. That night, Maya couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed while Sasha snored softly in the next room. Her mind was a whirlwind of possibilities and fears. What if it was too good to be true? What if she accepted and then failed? Did she have the right to accept help from someone who had humiliated her? She got up and prepared peppermint tea, as her mother used to do when she needed clarity. The steam rose from the cup in thin spirals, and Maya watched as they dissolved in the cold morning air. She thought of her grandmother, who had died when Maya was 12, but whose presence she still felt in important moments. Her grandmother used to say that opportunities come disguised in many forms, and that rejecting them out of pride was as foolish as rejecting them out of fear. Pride, her grandmother would say, is what keeps you standing when the world wants to see you kneeling. But pride without wisdom is just another form of prison. Maya took her phone and dialed her mother's number in Nigeria. It was 3 in the morning in New York, but dawn was already breaking in Lagos. Maya ma fille, her mother answered sleepily. What's wrong? Maya told her everything. The humiliation at the restaurant, her response, the letter, the offer, her doubts. Her mother listened in silence, as she always did, letting Maya's words settle before responding. My daughter, she finally said. When I was young, a rich man in the village insulted your grandmother at the market. He said she was an ignorant peasant. Your grandmother didn't answer him that day. But 6 months later, when that man got sick, and no city doctor could cure him, it was your grandmother who healed him with her knowledge of medicinal plants. Maya listened, feeling how the story intertwined with hers. And do you know what happened next? Her mother continued. That man offered her money, a lot of money, and your grandmother accepted it. Not because she forgave the insult, but because that money helped build the village well. It helped feed families during the drought. The humiliation was his. The money was just money. And your grandmother used it to do good. Do you think I should accept? Maya asked, although she already knew the answer. I think you should do what serves your future, not what serves your pain. Opportunities don't come with instruction manuals on who can give them to you. They come, and that's it. You decide what to do with them. When Maya hung up, she felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in weeks. Her mother was right. She always was. The next day, she filled out the application form. The following months were a roller coaster of emotions and changes. Maya continued working at the restaurant while awaiting responses from the universities. The application process was complex, requiring linguistic proficiency exams, essays, interviews. Every step was a new test of her abilities, but also a confirmation that she was prepared. Ethan's scholarship fund covered not only tuition, but also living expenses, study materials, and a monthly stipend that would allow her to leave her job at the restaurant if she was accepted. One afternoon in March, while serving lunch, she received an email on her phone. It was from Columbia University. Her heart was pounding so hard she had to excuse herself and take refuge in the restroom to open it. Dear Ms. Johnson, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into our master's program in conference translation and interpretation. Maya read the first line 3 times before the words truly sank in. She had been accepted, truly accepted, into one of the most competitive programs in the country. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back had eyes bright with tears, but also a smile that illuminated her entire face. It was the same woman who had arrived in New York 3 years earlier, with a suitcase and a diffuse dream, but she was also completely different. When she returned to the dining room, Mr. Chen looked at her curiously. Everything okay? Maya nodded, unable to speak yet. Then, when she finally found her voice, she said, "Yes, everything is more than okay." That night, they organized a small celebration in the apartment. Sasha invited some friends from the hospital, some colleagues from the restaurant came after their shift, and the small space was filled with laughter, music, and the warmth of people who were genuinely happy for another's success. "A speech!" someone shouted. Maya stood up, holding a glass of cheap wine that tasted better than any champagne. "I'm not good with speeches," she began, and everyone laughed. "But I want to say something. Everyone in this room knows what it's like to struggle. All of us have left something behind to build something ahead. And sometimes, when you're in the middle of that struggle, you feel like it will never end, that you will never be more than you are right now." She looked around, seeing faces that reflected her own experiences. "But this moving story I'm living taught me something, that every effort counts, that every hour you dedicate to improving, to learning, to growing accumulates. And one day, when you least expect it, all that effort turns into something real, into something no one can take away from you." Applause filled the small apartment, and Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: belonging. Not just to a place, but to a community of people who understood the value of perseverance. The start of the master's program in September marked the beginning of a new stage in Maya's life. The classes were intense, challenging, completely different from everything she had known. She found herself surrounded by brilliant students, many of them with previous degrees from prestigious universities, some with diplomat parents or professional translators. At first, Maya felt the weight of imposter syndrome. What was she doing there? A girl who had learned languages on buses and in public libraries, competing with people who had had private tutors and years of formal preparation. But every time that voice of doubt whispered in her mind, she remembered that night at the restaurant. She remembered how she had found her voice when it mattered most, and that gave her the strength to continue. Her simultaneous interpretation professor, Dr. Evans, was a serious woman in her 60s who had worked at the United Nations for decades. She had a reputation for being demanding to the point of severity. During the first weeks, Dr. Evans barely looked at Maya, but one day, after a particularly difficult practice interpreting Spanish into Arabic, the professor stopped her. "Ms. Johnson, can you stay for a moment?" Maya felt a knot in her stomach. She braced herself for criticism. "Your technique needs polishing," Dr. Evans began, and Maya nodded, awaiting the rest. "But there's something in your interpretation that cannot be taught. You don't just translate words, you translate intention, emotion, context. That is rare, very rare, especially in someone so young." Maya blinked, surprised. "Where did you learn Arabic?" the professor asked. "In a park," Maya replied honestly, "with Moroccan friends. We met on Sundays." Dr. Evans smiled for the first time since Maya had known her. "Sometimes the best education doesn't come from classrooms. It comes from life itself. Don't lose that. It's what will make you exceptional." That brief exchange changed something fundamental in Maya. She began to see her experiences not as deficiencies, but as unique strengths. While her classmates had learned languages in academic contexts, she had learned them in the trenches of real life, and that gave her an understanding of cultural nuances that textbooks could not teach. As the first semester progressed, Maya began to excel in specific areas. Her ability to grasp informal registers and idioms was superior to many of her classmates. When she interpreted, she didn't sound mechanical or artificial. She sounded natural, as if she truly thought in every language she spoke. One day in November, the university hosted an international conference on African migrations. They needed volunteer interpreters for the working sessions. Maya offered without hesitation. During one of the sessions, a Senegalese delegate began speaking in Wolof, assuming there would be translation into French, but the assigned interpreter did not master Wolof, only French and Spanish. There was a moment of confusion, nervous murmurs, until Maya got up from her seat. "I can interpret," she said, simply. The event coordinator looked at her doubtfully, but time was pressing. He handed her the headphones. The Senegalese delegate spoke about the diaspora, about separated families, about mothers sending their children to the other side of the world with the hope of a better future. He spoke about sacrifices that don't appear in statistics, about dreams that fit in small suitcases. Maya interpreted, but in her voice there was more than technical precision. There was lived truth, because every word she translated was also her own story. It was the story of her mother, of her grandmother, of millions of people whose lives were reduced to numbers in official reports. When the session ended, the Senegalese delegate approached her with tears in his eyes. "Jërëjëf," he said in Wolof. "Thank you. You didn't just translate my words, you translated my heart." That afternoon, several professors and organizers asked for her contact. Dr. Evans observed her from afar, with an expression Maya couldn't completely decipher, but which seemed to mix pride and recognition. "This is what it means to be an interpreter," the professor told her later. "It's not just knowing languages, it's being a bridge between worlds. And you, Ms. Johnson, were born to be that bridge." Maya returned home that night feeling that she had finally found her place in the world. She wasn't just another student. She was someone whose voice could make a real difference, but she also knew that the journey was just beginning. Final exams were approaching, and with them new challenges that would test everything she had learned. Winter arrived in New York with persistent rains that washed the streets and filled the air with a damp cold that got into the bones. Maya spent long hours in the university library, surrounded by translation theory books, specialized dictionaries, and recordings of speeches she had to interpret as practice. Sometimes, in the midst of the academic intensity, she received messages from her mother asking how she was. Maya always replied that everything was fine, but there were days when the pressure overwhelmed her, days when she felt that no matter how much she studied, it would never be enough, days when the fatigue accumulated like stones on her shoulders. One particularly difficult night, after failing a practice of simultaneous interpretation from German to Spanish, Maya was left alone in the library until the security guard kindly asked her to leave because they were closing. She walked in the rain without an umbrella, letting the cold water soak her hair and clothes. She needed to feel something physical, something to distract her from the pain of feeling inadequate. When she arrived at the apartment, Sasha was awake waiting for her, which was rare given her nurse schedule. "I was worried," Sasha said, handing her a towel. "You look terrible." Maya tried to smile, but instead began to cry. Not a silent, controlled cry, but a deep sob that seemed to come from a very old place within her. Sasha hugged her without saying anything, letting her vent. When Maya could finally speak, she told her about the failed practice, about her insecurities, about the constant fear of being in a place where she didn't really belong. "Do you know what your problem is?" Sasha said when Maya finished. "You compare yourself to people who had completely different lives. They might have had tutors, you had will. They might have had time, you had determination. They are not the same, but one is not better than the other either." Maya dried her tears, listening. "Look," Sasha continued, "I work in a hospital. I see brilliant doctors every day. Some studied at the best universities in the world. Others, like Dr. Okoro, studied in Nigeria in precarious conditions, with intermittent electricity, and books shared among 10 students. And guess what? Dr. Okoro is one of the best surgeons we have. Because when you learn to do something without resources, you develop a creativity and resilience that privilege can never teach." Maya felt something loosen in her chest. Sasha was right. She had been measuring her worth with the wrong yardstick. "Besides," Sasha added with a smile, How many people in your class can say they put a multimillionaire in his place in 8 languages? They don't teach that in any university. Maya laughed through her tears. It was true. That night at the restaurant had taught her something no book could convey, that her voice mattered, that her dignity was non-negotiable, and that knowledge without courage was incomplete. The next morning, Maya returned to the library with a renewed perspective. She asked Dr. Evans for help, who assigned her specific exercises to improve her speed in simultaneous interpretation. She worked harder than ever, but also with more compassion toward herself. And slowly, things began to improve. Spring arrived, transforming New York into a garden of flowers and golden light. Maya had passed the first semester with outstanding grades and was now facing more complex challenges. Professional internships were an integral part of the second semester, and students competed for the best opportunities. Maya applied for an internship at the United Nations headquarters, a possibility that seemed completely out of her reach. But Dr. Evans had encouraged her, telling her that her multilingual profile and experiential background made her an ideal candidate. While awaiting responses, she continued with her classes and began working part-time at an NGO that helped refugees with documentation procedures. It was volunteer work, but it allowed her to put her translation skills into practice in real contexts, helping people who, like her once, were navigating bureaucratic systems in languages they barely mastered. One Saturday afternoon, while helping a Syrian family fill out asylum application forms, she recognized in their eyes the same fear and hope she had seen in the mirror years ago. The mother squeezed her hand after Maya finished translating the positive response from the immigration officer. "There are no words enough to thank you," the woman said in broken Arabic. "You don't need to thank me," Maya replied. "Someone did this for me once. Now I do it for you." It was a lie. No one had done exactly this for her, but in a sense it was true, because many people had contributed with small gestures of kindness that, added up, had built the path she was now traveling. In April, she received an email from the United Nations. She had been selected for a 3-month internship starting in June. Maya read the email 5 times, each time with greater incredulity. How had she gotten here? From serving tables in a restaurant to interpreting at one of the most important institutions in the world. The leap seemed impossible, and yet it was happening. She called her mother that same night. On the other end of the line in Lagos, she heard the contained sob of maternal pride that no distance could diminish. "Your grandmother would be so proud," her mother said. "So proud." "You should be too," Maya replied. "None of this would exist without you." Because it was true. Every sacrifice her mother had made, every time she had worked double shifts to send her money, every word of encouragement in difficult moments, all of that lived now in this moment of triumph. That night, Maya wrote in her diary, "Sometimes I think of that version of me who arrived in New York with a suitcase and a heart full of fear. I wish I could tell her that it would all be worth it, that every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt would eventually become steps towards something beautiful. This moving story I'm living is not perfect, but it is mine, and that makes it invaluable." The 2 months before leaving for New York were a whirlwind of preparations and temporary goodbyes. Maya had to find someone to occupy her room while she was away, organize her belongings, and complete the last semester exams with grades that would allow her to keep her scholarship. The restaurant The High View organized a small farewell party. Mr. Chen, the manager, gave a short speech that made more than one employee cry. "Maya arrived here 3 years ago," he said, "and from the first day I knew she wouldn't stay long. Not because she wasn't good at her job, but precisely because she was too good for this place to be her final destination. But I never imagined how far she would go, and I will. Never forget the night she taught us all that true wealth is not in bank accounts, but in character." Several regular diners had come specifically to say goodbye. Among them, surprisingly, was Ethan Clark. Maya hadn't seen him since that night. They had only exchanged formal emails related to the scholarship. Seeing him there in the same restaurant where everything had begun created a moment of silent tension. Ethan approached with uncertain steps, like someone walking on unfamiliar ground. "Maya," he said simply, "I came to say goodbye and to thank you." "To thank me?" Maya asked, genuinely surprised. "For saving me," he replied. "I know it sounds dramatic, but it's the truth. That night when you held a mirror up to my face, You gave me the opportunity to become someone better. I've spent the last year working on that, in therapy, in reviewing my relationships, in trying to use my money to build instead of destroy. He extended his hand, and Maya took it. The scholarship fund has already helped 15 more people, Ethan continued. Each one of them has a story like yours, like mine, and every time I read their applications, I remember why I did it, why it matters. I'm glad, Maya said sincerely. I'm glad that something good came out of that. More than something good, Ethan corrected. Something transformative. They said goodbye with a brief but sincere hug, and Maya felt a circle closing. The person who had humiliated her had become an ally in her success. Not because she had explicitly forgiven him, but because both had chosen to grow instead of remaining trapped in that moment. The last day before leaving for New York, Maya walked through the streets of New York that had been her home for 3 intense years. She passed the library where she had studied, the park where she had practiced Arabic, the bus stop where she waited every morning to go to the restaurant. Every place held memories, some painful, many beautiful, all necessary. She stopped, in front of the East River, watching the waves softly lap the shore. She thought of all the seas she had crossed, literally and metaphorically, to get here, and of all the seas that still awaited her. She took out her phone and recorded a voice message for her mother. "Mum, tomorrow I travel to the United Nations. I have fear and excitement in equal measure, but I also have something I didn't have when I arrived in the US. Certainty. Certainty that I belong at any table where I sit. Certainty that my voice matters. Certainty that everything you taught me about dignity was not just pretty words, but survival tools. I love you, and I promise I will make you proud every day of my life." She sent the message and took a deep breath. The salty air filled her lungs, and Maya smiled. She was ready. New York was a city completely different from Lagos, more formal, more institutional. The United Nations headquarters stood as a symbol of power and bureaucracy, with its endless corridors where all the official languages of the world and many more were spoken. The first days were overwhelming. Maya found herself interpreting sessions on agricultural policies, trade regulations, international agreements. The topics were complex and technical, very different from the conversations about migration or human rights that she was passionate about. But she adapted. She studied specialized terminology until late at night. She observed veteran interpreters with decades of experience. She took meticulous notes on techniques, on how to manage the stress of simultaneous interpretation, on how to maintain neutrality even when translating speeches with which she personally or politically disagreed. One day in July, there was a special session on refugee crises. Maya was assigned to the interpretation booth for African languages. During the session, a representative of an NGO began to speak passionately about the inhumane conditions in detention centers for migrants. While interpreting, Maya felt her voice begin to break, because those were not just abstract statistics. They were people, they were families, they were versions of herself that hadn't had the same luck. When the session ended, her supervisor, a French woman named Madame Dubois, called her into her office. "Miss Johnson," she began in a serious voice, "I need to talk to you about your interpretation today." Maya felt a knot in her stomach. Had she made a technical mistake? "Your interpretation was technically impeccable," Madame Dubois continued, "but I noticed something else. I noticed emotion, and that can be problematic for a professional interpreter." Maya nodded, bracing for the criticism. "However," the supervisor paused, "I also noticed that that emotion did not distort the message. It amplified it. It gave it a humanity that is often lost in these very technical sessions. The delegates have commented to me that your interpretation allowed them to truly feel what the speaker was communicating." Madame Dubois leaned back in her chair. "There is a constant debate in our profession about absolute neutrality versus interpretation with soul. I used to firmly believe in the former, but interpreters like you make me question if we haven't confused neutrality with disconnection." It was a revealing moment for Maya. She was learning that she didn't have to choose between being professional and being human, that her personal story was not an obstacle to her career, but potentially her greatest strength. But then, at the end of July, she received news that put her at an emotional crossroads. Madame Dubois called her into her office again. "I have a proposal for you," she said. "We have been very impressed with your work. There is a possibility to extend your internship and eventually convert it into a permanent position here at the UN. It's rare for this to happen with interns, but your profile is exceptional. It was everything Maya had dreamed of. Stability, recognition, a brilliant career in one of the world's most prestigious institutions. But, Madame Dubois continued, I also received a call from the NGO where you worked in New York. They are expanding their operations and are looking for a linguistic services coordinator to support refugees throughout the tri-state area. They specifically mentioned your name. The salary would be significantly lower than what we could offer you here, and the conditions more precarious. But the direct impact on human lives would be incomparable. Maya felt how two completely different futures unfolded before her. One was secure, prestigious, comfortable. The other was uncertain, complicated, but aligned with something deeper within her. How much time do I have to decide? She asked. 2 weeks, Madame Dubois replied. But Maya, can I tell you something? There is no incorrect decision here. Just two different paths toward different ways of making a difference. The question is not which is better, but which is more yours. That night, Maya walked alone through the streets of New York, feeling the weight of the decision as something physical on her shoulders. She called her mother, Sasha, Dr. Evans. Each one gave her valuable perspectives, but none gave her the answer, because the answer had to come from within. She sat on a bench in front of a park, watching families stroll, children play, people living ordinary lives that were extraordinary to them. And she thought about that night at the restaurant. She thought about the power of using her voice not just to speak, but to elevate the voices of others. The UN was important, but maybe it wasn't her place. Not now. Maybe someday, but not at this moment in her life where she still had so much fire inside, so much urgency to make a visible and direct difference. She made a decision, and in doing so, she felt something inside her align perfectly, like a key fitting into its exact lock. Maya returned to New York in September with a clarity she had never before experienced. She had rejected the position at the UN, choosing instead to coordinate linguistic services for the NGO that helped refugees. It was not the most lucrative or prestigious decision by traditional standards, but it was hers. The NGO, called Bridges Without Borders, operated from a modest office in the Lower East Side. Maya was in charge of recruiting and training volunteer translators, developing multilingual materials, and being present in courts and hospitals when refugee families needed to communicate in systems they didn't understand. It was exhausting work. Some days she interpreted for 8 hours straight. Other days she dealt with the frustration of bureaucracies that seemed designed to confuse rather than help. There were moments of deep sadness when the stories she translated were so devastating that she carried the pain home. But there were also moments of indescribable beauty, like when an Afghan mother hugged her, crying, after Maya helped her reunite with her son after 2 years of separation. Like when a young Syrian man who had arrived without speaking a word of English started working as a volunteer translator after Maya trained him. Like when a Congolese family invited her to dinner to thank her for having helped them obtain asylum. These moments did not appear in official reports or success statistics, but they were real. And for Maya, they were enough. During the first months at the NGO, Maya developed a training program that combined language teaching with cultural sensitivity. She worked with volunteer translators, many of them refugees who wanted to give something back to the community that had welcomed them. She taught them not only translation techniques, but also the importance of empathy, of respect, of understanding that every word they translated could change the course of someone's life. One of her first students was Rashid, a 25-year-old Sudanese man who had arrived in the US in a crowded boat. He had acute natural talent for languages and spoke 5 fluently, but he also carried invisible scars from his journey. "I don't know if I can do this," he confessed one day, after a particularly difficult session where he had to translate the testimony of a woman who had lost her family at sea. "Every story brings me back to my own journey. I don't know how to stay neutral." Maya looked at him with understanding. "Who told you you have to be neutral? You have to be accurate, you have to be professional, you have to respect confidentiality. But neutral, that's another thing. Your empathy is not weakness. It's what makes you excellent at this." Over time, Rashid became one of the most requested translators in the organization, and every time Maya saw him work, She saw her own story reflected, her own path of transformation. A year after her return, the NGO organized a conference on the role of linguistic services in refugee integration. Maya was invited to give a talk. The auditorium was full of social workers, government officials, volunteers, and refugees whose testimonies were part of the program. She stepped up to the podium, feeling the same butterflies in her stomach she had felt that night at the restaurant. But this time was different. This time she was speaking not to defend herself, but to inspire. "My name is Maya Johnson," she began, "and I arrived in the US 5 years ago with a small suitcase and an uncertain future. For a long time I worked as a waitress, studying languages in every free moment I had. I wasn't doing it thinking I would be a professional interpreter someday. I was doing it because I felt that every language was a key that opened doors that were previously closed." She looked at the audience, seeing attentive faces of all ages and backgrounds. "There was a specific moment that changed my life," she continued. "One night, when someone tried to humiliate me publicly. And instead of accepting that humiliation, I found my voice. I spoke in 8 languages, not to prove anything, but simply to remind myself that my dignity was non-negotiable." She narrated the complete story, the humiliation, the response, the subsequent transformation. The audience listened in absolute silence, and Maya could see that many saw themselves reflected in parts of her story. "This moving story didn't end that night," she said. "In fact, it barely began, because what I learned is that languages are not just tools for communication. They are bridges. They are ways of telling someone, I see you, I hear you, you matter." She talked about her work at the NGO, about the families she had helped, about the importance of having accessible linguistic services for all people, regardless of their legal status or ability to pay. "I had the opportunity to work at the United Nations," she shared. "It was a prestigious, well-paid position with all the securities someone like me could desire, and I rejected it, not because it wasn't valuable, but because it was not my path at this moment in my life." She paused, letting the words settle. "Sometimes we think that success is measured in titles and salaries, but I have learned that true success is measured in impact, in how many lives you touch, in how much dignity you return to the world. And every time I translate for someone who has no voice in this language, in this system, I am returning something that was given to me." When she finished her talk, the ovation was prolonged and sincere. But what touched Maya the most was when a young Nigerian woman approached her afterwards, with bright eyes. "I'm also from Lagos," she said in Yoruba, "and hearing you made me feel that it is possible, that I can get to where you have arrived." Maya hugged her, feeling how the story was repeating itself, how each generation passed the torch to the next. "It is more than possible," she told her. "It is inevitable if you don't give up." The young woman, named Aisha, started working as a volunteer at the NGO. Maya took her under her wing, teaching her everything she had learned. She saw in Aisha the same hunger for self-improvement, the same silent determination that she herself had had years ago. Months later, Maya received an email from Ethan Clark. The scholarship fund had grown significantly and now supported more than 50 students across the United States and Europe. Ethan asked if Maya would be willing to join the selection committee to ensure that the scholarships reached those who truly needed them. Maya accepted, not because she had completely forgiven that initial humiliation, but because she had learned that some wounds, when healed properly, turn into wisdom that can help others. The first committee meeting was held in Boston. Maya entered the conference room, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and confidence. Ethan was there, along with other members, academics, philanthropists, former fund beneficiaries. When Ethan saw her, he stood up and walked toward her. "Maya, thank you for coming. Your perspective is exactly what this committee needs." During the meeting, they reviewed dozens of applications. Each one told a story of struggle, of deferred dreams, of potential waiting to be released. Maya read each application carefully, looking not only for academic excellence, but also for that intangible spark she recognized in herself, the determination to turn pain into purpose. "This one," she said, pointing to the application of a young Eritrean woman who worked cleaning offices while studying medicine at night. "This one deserves an opportunity." The committee approved her recommendation, and Maya felt a deep satisfaction. She was closing the circle, transforming her own experience into opportunities for others. On her 5th anniversary in the US, Maya organized a small celebration. She invited Sasha, some colleagues from the NGO, students she had mentored, refugee families who had become friends. Her apartment, now a little bigger, was filled with different languages intertwining in the air like a symphony. Sasha had prepared a special dish, a fusion of Nigerian and American cuisine that made everyone laugh because of how unexpectedly delicious it was. Rashid brought his wife, whom he had met working as a translator. Aisha was there with her family, who had just received refugee status after months of procedures that Maya had helped with. Mr. Chen, the former restaurant manager, also came, bringing a bottle of wine from the entire team. "The High View has never been the same without you," he joked, "but we are proud of what you have achieved." As the night progressed, someone asked Maya to say a few words. She stood up, looking at the faces gathered around her, each one representing a different part of her journey. "5 years ago," she began, "I arrived in this city knowing no one, not knowing if I would succeed or fail. I worked difficult jobs. I studied until exhaustion, and there were many nights when I thought about giving up." She took Sasha's hand, who was sitting next to her, "But I found family where I didn't expect to find it. I found strength in places where I thought there was only weakness. And I learned that the path to who you want to be is never straight or easy, but it is always worth it." She looked at Rashid and Aisha. "And now I have the privilege of walking alongside others who are making their own journeys, of being the bridge that others were for. Me," she raised her glass, "to everyone here, to everyone who helped us get here, and to everyone who will come after us, because this moving story is not just mine, it is ours." The toast echoed in the apartment, and Maya felt a fullness that no professional achievement could equal. As she listened to the conversations around her, Maya thought of her grandmother, who had never left her village, but whose wisdom had crossed oceans. She thought of her mother, who worked tirelessly so that her daughter could fly. She thought of all the versions of herself she had been. The child in Nigeria, the frightened newcomer, the determined waitress, the insecure student, the interpreter in training, the committed professional. All those versions still lived in her, each one contributing something essential to who she was now. Later that night, when everyone had left and the apartment was silent again, Maya approached the window, looking at the city that had welcomed and transformed her. New York shone under the night sky, its lights twinkling like earthly stars. She opened her notebook, that same worn diary she had carried with her since Nigeria, and wrote, "Today I celebrated 5 years in the US, 5 years that seem like a whole life, and at the same time a blink. I have learned that dignity is not something others can give or take away. It is something you carry within, that you protect, that you cultivate every day. I have learned that languages are more than words. They are windows to different worlds, bridges between hearts that beat at different rhythms, but with the same essential humanity. And I have learned that true success is not measured in what you achieve for yourself, but in the doors you open for others." She closed the notebook and smiled. She knew that there were still challenges ahead. The NGO constantly faced funding problems. There were difficult days where bureaucratic systems seemed designed to crush hopes. There were stories that didn't have happy endings, families that couldn't reunite, asylum applications that were rejected. But she also knew that every small victory mattered. Every person she helped communicate, every student she mentored, every bridge she built between cultures and languages, all of that was part of something bigger. What a moment, she thought, smiling. What an extraordinary story had brought her here, and the most beautiful thing was that the story was still being written, one day at a time, one voice, translated at a time, one bridge built at a time. Because in the end, that was what it meant to live with dignity, not allowing circumstances to define your worth, but using every experience, even the painful ones, to become someone who leaves the world a little better than they found it. Maya Johnson had found her voice that night at the restaurant, but the true revelation was discovering that her voice could amplify the voices of others, that her story could inspire other stories, that her preserved dignity could help others preserve theirs, and that, she thought, as the first lights of dawn began to illuminate the New York horizon, was more valuable than any title, any recognition, any conventional measure of success. It was simply real. It was deeply human. It was a life lived with purpose and an open heart, where every translated word was an act of love, every built bridge was a monument to hope, and every day was an opportunity to remember that true wealth resides not in what you accumulate, but in what you share. She took a deep breath, feeling the fresh morning air fill her lungs. New challenges awaited her, new stories to translate, new lives to touch, and she was ready, because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that a person's worth is not measured by where they start, but by the dignity with which they walk their path, by the kindness they offer along the way, and by the doors they open for those who come behind. The city was slowly waking up, and with it, thousands of stories were beginning a new chapter, and Maya knew that her story, intertwined with so many others, was part of a larger fabric, a collective narrative of hope, resilience, and transformation.